everyone, I am Dr. Megan Graff with Movement Rx. I am a physical therapist, runner, strength coach, running coach. I kind of do it all, but I love working with athletes of all kinds. But running is kind of where my passion is and what I have the most history with. So I've been a running coach for, 8 or 9 years. I've been running marathons for 10 years. I've done 23 marathons, so I have a lot of miles under my belt to be able to speak to helping you all not make the same mistakes that I did throughout all of my training. So whether you are doing short, fast runs in CrossFit, or maybe you want to run your first 5K or half marathon, regardless of what distance you want to be able to do, I'm going to help you do that without hurting yourself and learning how to make it suck less, because I know a lot of people hate running because it is so hard. So let's try to make it easier on you, and then just how to do it without injuring yourself and feeling better. All right, so some of the main things that I see specific to female athletes as far as problems that you might face with running or why running sometimes feels harder, one of the main things is posture. So a lot of times I'll see women a lot more extended, ribs are flared, hips are kind of tilted forward, especially if you have any trouble with hip, lower back pain, any pelvic floor issues like leakage or feeling pelvic heaviness while you're running. Running with this posture can exacerbate that. So in a little bit, we're going to talk about tips of how to address that. But that posture is a very common thing that I see is a problem with female athletes. So the other thing when it comes to running mechanics, so we're built differently from men. So our hips are inherently a little bit wider, and because of that, we have something different called a Q angle that's a little more exaggerated or pronounced as a female. And so with that, when we run, a lot of times women will have a little bit more of what is called a crossover gait. So either when you're running, the foot completely crosses over midline, or it's almost like we run on a tightrope sometimes. And because of wider hips, that puts a lot more stress on the IT band, the outside of the hips, and the knees. And so those are very common places that I see people having pain and problems. And some of that comes down to posture, but it can be addressed by addressing running mechanics. And along the same lines, when it comes to running mechanics, because of that same Q angle with the wider hips, it's normal to have a little bit of hip drop when we're running. So when you land, as a part of shock absorption, our hips drop just a tiny bit, the knee bends. It's also that we can absorb shock. But with females, I tend to see it really exaggerated. We're not able to attenuate those forces, being able to stay strong through the hip and keep from having too much hip drop. And along those same lines, what tends to tie into that is the knee dropping in as well. So I see this kind of running gait a lot, which again can put a lot of stress on the outside of the hip and the knee as well, and it kind of torques the lower back and the SI joint. So those are all common areas that I'll see pain develop in female athletes, and a lot of it comes down to those running mechanics. So the last thing that I want to speak to that as a female that you might deal with, and you might notice as you start picking up, maybe trying to run a little bit more, is feeling different as your cycle changes. So depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle, you might notice like you feel like a rock star and you're able to run really hard at some points of your cycle, and then other ones you just feel like crap, like everything hurts, energy levels are down, and it's okay to know that that's normal to have those differences in how you feel. But one thing that we can address through strengthening and addressing biomechanics is if you notice an increase in symptoms as far as pain or increased problems at your pelvic floor, as far as more problems with leakage or pelvic heaviness, potentially increasing at different times of your cycle, by working on strength training and addressing your mechanics, you can decrease the intensity of those symptoms or potentially keep them from increasing at all during those times of your cycle. So now we're going to get into some tips for improving your running. So first, first and probably the most important thing when it comes to decreasing injury risk for running, but also just making it easier on yourself, is having faster turnover, so quick feet when you're running. So the number one thing that causes injury with running, and it's the most common thing that I see with running mechanics, is that people tend to take a really big stride out. And so every time we do that, it's braking forces. So every time you're taking a stride and your foot lands way in front of your body, you're putting on the brakes. So again, you're having to overcome those forces. You're making running harder than it needs to be. But also those forces really are hard on the joints and increase your risk for injury. So to try to address that, it's gonna feel really funky at first. So just expect that. It's not gonna feel natural to you, and that's okay. So first, I like to start having people practice the fast feet or fast turnover in place. So just starting with trying to jog in place and keep your feet moving fast. And then keeping your pace slow, start moving forward, keeping your fast feet. So with that, your feet end up landing a little bit flatter, and they end up landing kind of right under your body versus way out in front. So what you'll probably find is that you may feel like you're running on your toes, which it does end up putting your weight a little bit forward, so you'll feel like you're landing a little more ball of your foot to middle of your foot, which is okay. But the thing that I want you to try to watch for with that is that you're not way up on your tiptoes, because then your calves are gonna be really pissed off. So try to keep your ankles relaxed. So it's almost like I'm picking up from my knee or from my hip rather than pushing up with my toes to do it. So you shouldn't feel really bouncy. It's just nice and light with quick feet. And then just practicing moving forward with those mechanics, and as you get more comfortable with it, starting to speed up. So obviously, most of us are not running like this. You can practice that, it's good to practice, but ultimately we want to get to where you can practice those mechanics with your normal pace that you're trying to maybe do on an easy warm-up jog before a workout or for a run itself, and then trying to put those mechanics into a 200-meter run or a 400-meter run in your WOD. So it takes practicing it on its own and then trying those really fast feet even when you're out trying to run a 200 or 400. So fast feet is number one. All right, so tip number two is having soft steps, soft feet, soft landing. It goes hand in hand with what we talked about in the last video as far as fast feet. Now you want to think about landing softly. Like I talked about before, we tend to have that big stride. The other common thing is that people are really loud when they run. And so when you do that, all of that noise is, again, force going up through your body, so you're making it really hard on your joints. So you want to try to land softly. The way I always like to think about it is try to sneak up on the person in front of you. They shouldn't be able to hear you coming from a mile away, like I tend to see with a lot, or hear rather, with a lot of my runners. So when you're practicing your fast feet, also practice landing softly. You should barely be able to hear yourself landing. And if you have somebody that's maybe running in front of you in a workout, make it your goal to sneak up on them and scare them. But what you want to watch out for here is you don't want to get really prancy trying to run softly. So still try to keep it feeling natural, but just land nice and light on your feet. Number three is run relaxed. It seems maybe counterintuitive, but just like we've talked about, fast feet and landing softly, sometimes when we're concentrating on those things, it becomes like, okay, I got it, and the next thing you know, your shoulders are up in your ears, and you're kind of holding your breath, and you're like, she said this was supposed to make running easier, and I'm feeling way out of breath. Chances are, you're maybe concentrating a little too hard, and you want to run nice and relaxed. So thinking about just one, kind of checking in and seeing, do I feel like my shoulders are tensing up? So thinking about relaxing. I know running for a lot of people is not a relaxing activity, but that's where, this is a great time to play around with trying to run easy. Like, go out for a 30-minute run and run like this. Who cares what people think of how you look? It's a good way way to practice running easier, running more relaxed, and practicing those fast feet and running softly. You might find like, oh, running doesn't have to be terrible when I'm not running, at max capacity all the time. So try practicing running relaxed, and to do that, try running easy. Tip number 4 is focus on your breathing. I've given you a lot of things to think about so far. So if anything, play around with focusing on one aspect at a time, because it can be really overwhelming. It'll start to feel more natural, but if you find that it doesn't matter what pace you're running and you tend to get out of breath and winded so easily and running just feels awful, it may just be that you're not breathing efficiently. This was my biggest downfall for a long time, and it took me a lot of years to realize that was a problem. So let me hopefully save you a lot of heartache. So practice taking deep breaths. So when you're practicing running easy, I challenge you to go out for a run and try only breathing through your nose. Breathing in and out through your nose, you may find that you can only do a fast walk, and that's okay. Because a lot of times, as soon as we get to a higher intensity, and whether this is on the rower or the bike, but especially with running, we tend to get really short and shallow with our breaths. And so you're only using like this tiny portion of your lungs versus this whole big area that you have available to you. So when you're only breathing through your nose, it really forces you to take a nice deep breath. So practice it at a very low intensity, and like I said, you may even just practice it walking, or if you're hiking, just to get used to accessing your full lung capacity when you're trying to go at a little bit higher intensity. So once you've practiced that once or twice, then start implementing, okay, let me just pay attention to my breathing as I'm running at a little bit higher intensity. So when you're running, obviously you can go back to breathing through your mouth, but instead of, let me just breathe without thinking, try to focus on 2 to 3 second inhale and then 2 to 3 second exhale. So thinking about a little bit longer breath in and then a little bit longer breath out. So typically when I was first trying to train my breathing, I would do a 3 second inhale, 2 second exhale, just to make sure that even as I was trying to run harder and run faster, I was still really accessing rib expansion lower down and filling up my full lungs versus just breathing shallow and again, getting really tense up here and not running relaxed. So when you focus on that slower, big breath in, a little bit faster on the exhale, then you might find, again, running doesn't have to suck as bad if you maybe just are breathing a little bit better, but it takes a little bit of practice if you have been one of these kind of tense, shallow breathers like I was for a very long time. And I think between that and some of the mechanics, you might find that running opens up a whole new world. So tip number 5 is on posture. I spoke to this a little bit earlier in one of the other videos. So talking about how a lot of times the ribs tend to be a little bit flared out, the hips are tilted forward. We get into this habit of hanging out in this posture, and then it carries over into our running. So especially if you deal with lower or mid-back pain, maybe some hip pain, that posture can have to do with it, as well as any pelvic floor issues. So our breathing diaphragm and our pelvic diaphragm, or the muscles of our pelvic floor, are supposed to work in sync. So when you take a breath in, your breathing diaphragm comes down and your pelvic floor is supposed to do it a little bit as well. And so when we change how those two diaphragms are sitting, it changes the pressure on our pelvic floor. So especially if you deal with those issues, this can play a lot into it. So one, before you start running, just kind of check in with what is my resting posture and am I carrying that over to my running? So just checking in. One, maybe use a mirror if you're not sure, but trying to reset just a little bit. Draw your rib cage down and a slight squeeze of the hips forward. Now that doesn't mean I want you walking around like this or running like this. And it doesn't need to be 24/7. I see a lot of times women kind of go the other direction, and it's like, oh, well, she told me that I need to be like braced all the time and like this, it's not the end of the world if your posture is here a little bit, but especially if you're dealing with some discomfort, trying to check in and reset out of that a little bit, and doing it with the absolute minimal tension needed to achieve that. So if my resting posture is here, I don't need to get 100% tension and be walking around like I have to poop. So you want to do just the bare minimum needed. Like I feel like it takes me 5 to 10% muscle tension to reset out of that position, and I'm good to go and I can maintain that versus like really trying to brace and hold everything tight. That can create other issues. So trying to address your posture by just changing how kind of things are stacked or aligned, but doing it without trying to tense everything up. Because what was our other tip? Run relaxed. So you want to be able to get into a good posture, but try to stay a little more relaxed about it. So a couple things to think about. You want to start from the top. What I like to visualize is, you know, if there was a string tied to the top of my head and there's a drone flying above me and it's kind of holding me up, that's the posture you want to think about. So just an ever so slight chin tuck to keep your head in neutral with your shoulders, so you're not running like this with shoulders forward and chin is forward, which again, that tends to be our posture as we kind of sit around throughout the day, and especially as we get fatigued in our running, we tend to run a little bit more like that. So being mindful of your posture, standing nice and tall, having that string tied to the top of your head, so head, shoulders, head is stacked over shoulders, and just ever so slight draw of the shoulders back. So again, I'm not exaggerating and pulling way back and holding really tense, but my shoulders do have a tendency to sit a little bit forward, and so I just kind of check in and gently pull them back. Check in that my ribs are a little bit drawn down, my hips are in neutral, and then I can practice playing around with, again, the quick feet and starting to move forward. So you want to stay in that nice stacked posture, but when it comes to running, you know, we tend to talk about kind of a forward lean in order to keep yourself landing right on top of your feet and not doing that overstriding. But a lot of times when you think or hear forward lean, we do like this, and we bend at the hips. So try to think about that nice straight line from ears all the way down to ankles, but as you're doing it, it's this straight line here and not bending at the hips. So the way that I personally like to think about it, the way that it helps me remember, is I'm kind of leading with my hips. So it keeps me running tall, but the thing that I would say just to be mindful of is that you don't then start to lean back. So find that happy medium of staying nice and relaxed and upright, feeling like you're kind of falling forward, but you're staying tall with your running, and not leaning from here. And so that way especially as you're running faster, your power and your propulsion is coming from pushing behind, and I'm still landing underneath myself versus I'm trying to go faster and I'm reaching forward. So it should be a bigger fall forward. You get good propulsion from the glutes from behind, and it all comes down to posture and alignment that really helps one with any kind of nagging aches and pains you might have from living in this posture, but it really helps with efficiency and transfer of energy to make running easier with less effort. Just as a wrap up, so we went over 5 tips that are going to be most helpful for making running suck less for you. So number 1 is fast feet. So quick turnover, staying light on your feet is number 2. So running softly and running relaxed. So all of these things kind of really tie into each other. But a lot of times we're paying attention to one, we kind of start to neglect the other, and typically it's that we get really tense. So run nice and relaxed, focus on your breathing, trying to take nice deep breaths, and then just being mindful of your posture. So if you have a running WOD coming up and you want to know, okay, this was a lot of things, how do I even work on any of these things? Like I said, maybe try to pick one thing that you know you really struggle with. If your breathing is the toughest, you tend to get side stitches like within the first round of running. Try to focus on your breathing and doing those nice deep breaths, and then you can mess with the mechanics part of it later, as far as the fast feet and running relaxed and all of that. But if you're like, I just hate running in general and it's hard, the number one place I would start is with the fast turnover and trying to run soft. So it's good, like I said, it's going to feel really goofy at first. It's going to feel really unnatural, short and choppy, but it should actually feel a little bit easier and less hard on your body. You might find that different things are a little bit sore and tired. A lot of times the calves and hamstrings might feel a little more tired. You're working different muscles. It's normal to be sore in a different place when you start implementing this stuff. But if you have like nagging knee pain or just running feels really hard and like a lot of effort, you should find that pretty quickly or within the first session of implementing this stuff, that feels different. It should feel better. So hopefully you all found this helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to talking to y'all again.